All right, welcome again to another OpenShift Commons briefing. Today, as we do on Fridays, we're going to talk about transformation, cultural shifts, all kinds of interesting things that we do with the folks from the Global Transformation Office here at Red Hat. And today we have Kevin Behr back again, and he's going to talk about anti-patterns of DevOps. In particular, he's going to rant, hopefully, on DevOps and ownership. And I guess who owns DevOps? So,
Exactly.
Kevin, take it away. We'll have live Q&A at the end, so ask your questions in the chat wherever you are, and we'll get going. So take it away, Kevin.
Awesome, Diane. Thanks for having me. And I want to talk a little bit about DevOps ownership today. As I and other members of the GTO at Red Hat, or the Global Transformation Office, rather, are moving around with executives, and we're talking with teams, and we're talking with middle managers. We're talking to chief executive officers, chief financial officers, and chief information and technology officers, and security officers. There's a lot of people in our kind of everyday shuffle that we're talking with. And since we really don't sell anything in the Global Transformation Office, we're here to actually work with executives and organizations on their transformations. And literally, we are here to listen and provide whatever perspectives we can. And so in that kind of vein, one of the things I see a lot, and as I'm in the kind of larger enterprise technology groups, one of the things I'm seeing is that there's a large percentage of these orgs, maybe about a third of them, that seem to have kind of built DevOps into an organizational function. And one of the things you won't hear me rail on is about silos and a lot of the kind of what I consider to be useless tropes in organizations about why they can't do things and why things can't get done. The reason I say they're useless is it's not that they're not true. I'm wearing a shirt here that can talk about facts and how they don't really convey the true essence of what's happening. So these are my buddies and cohorts and colleagues in the GTO that I've been working with, and Andrew and John and Jay. I don't think they really need any introduction. So DevOps teams. This is a thing that actually really bothers me, not for the same reason I think that it bothers a lot of people. I don't like the way the word teams has been overloaded to actually mean organizational functions. In other words, you're seeing this used, and kind of the classic argument trope goes like this. You have DevOps in your title, and that's bad. Or you have a VP of DevOps, or somebody who heads up DevOps in your organization. There's a functional unit of some sort that contains all of the air quote DevOps. And the reason why I don't like teams is because typically in an organization where you don't have the organizational function and you have that more free-flowing collaboration across multiple disciplines and functions, you have a team that assembles dynamically. And so I don't think teams is the right word to refer to the organizational function, and I don't think it's the right place to have an argument about it. Remember, we're using made-up words here, and I'll get into that more later. So the other big problem I find here is that generally the CXOs that I'm talking to don't really understand what DevOps is. And you can't blame them, because a lot of the people that are telling them don't really understand, and certainly a lot of vendors don't understand. And I believe a lot of vendors have hijacked that. And yes, I am aware that I'm working for a vendor now, but one of the reasons why I came here is that this organization really embodies a lot of the collaboration principles and open source principles that really, really are important inside of your organization to actually ignite and really sustain developer and operations interactions. And in general, we'll find that our top leadership uses completely disproven organizing methods, right? You will hear countless amounts of things about accountability and organizational focus from execs. But one of the things that I think execs often don't understand, and again, I'm being very general here, but take what works. We actually don't organize around our work in many cases in our companies. We organize around HR's ideas of spans, layers, titles, and then our job descriptions. How many of us in technology look at our job descriptions and we're like, yeah, I guess maybe I do some of that, but it doesn't really capture what I do. Our titles in many cases don't capture what we do. And they certainly don't belie the interactions we need to have in many cases with people outside of our functional groups. So the notion of Taylor ideas, it comes down to this, right? Taylor made an observation. He's famous for making this observation back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and Frederick Winslow Taylor, by the way. And basically, he was kind of the father of, and man, I'm using a lot of air quotes, but I'm air quoting scientific management. And his idea was, at the kind of at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and so his idea was based on this one observation, I believe. He watched workers walking home from work, and then he watched workers coming in from work, to work rather, and realized that workers walk home faster than they walk to work. And the conclusion that he made was that workers are lazy, and workers need to be motivated and told what to do. And so he focused a lot on a concept called division of labor. And, I think the classic example has him in the pin factory, and where he splits the making of a pin into so many pieces that nobody really understands what the other people do in the process because they're so focused on their part of the pin. And his theory is that by focusing on a smaller piece of the problem, you could get better and demonstrate more mastery and speed up production and increase quality. Well, the truth is that kind of worked for a while. The key is kind of and worked for a while, but it became the basis of a lot of management thinking that a lot of people don't even understand, right? So I want to kind of talk a little bit about the fact that we as companies are experiencing organizational nightmares as we push all of the boundaries of what humans can handle, how many people we can know, how many people we can trust, how many things we can keep in our head in terms of tasks, right? These things push us to the edge of and beyond our actual human capabilities that are innate in us as humans. And so these kind of information physics, trust, all these things are broken by the way organizations work in the enterprise. And so you can tell that the focus that put them together was really more about control, more about keeping the enterprise stable, and more about kind of the enterprise value of, enterprise goodwill, which is something that executives understand and is actually on your balance sheet, which kind of is based on the notion that people trust your company's name more than they trust any of the individuals in the company. So the goodwill is for the whole enterprise, right? Versus something like maybe a famous steakhouse named after an athlete. The goodwill that you're going to that company for is based on that athlete and your admiration or respect or some sort of connection to the food that they might have. So that's the opposite of enterprise goodwill. That's individual goodwill. So enterprises are built for enterprise goodwill, which if you kind of take it apart in a weird way, like I do, kind of means that the actions of any one person cannot take down the enterprise. But also because of that kind of hardening and the structures that we've put in place and the divisions that we've put in place, I mean, these words are key, right? The division really says a lot. That basically we don't seem to understand in leadership that basically the structure we're in is meant to prevent substantive change. And I want to repeat that. The structure of the enterprise and its basic organizational tenets actually play into enterprise goodwill, not change. So why is it that we see enterprises talking about digital transformation and appointing chief digital officers? Because they're not digital. Why are they talking about agile and DevOps? Because they're not agile. They're slow. Executives use these words to mean different things than what we think they do. We kind of maybe will be hinted at the fact that they don't understand the full dimension of what that means. But to be honest, I'm not sure all of us or any of us really do. There's a lot of constructs involved here. But my point is that when executives say we want to be agile, we want to deliver faster and get features to our customers so that they can approve them or love them or hate them, we can get quick feedback. In essence, if you flip it around, there's a negative side to that. That's the internal messaging, which is we're not fast. We don't experiment enough. We don't know what our customers mean at some level. The reason we have to transform is because we are not at the place we need to be in the market to compete today and or take advantage of all the opportunities. So when we hear leadership talking about transformation and we talk about organizational change, we have to understand that we may not actually understand what behaviors we need to change, what organizational elements will actually make that much more possible and likely, and then how we incentivize all of these units to work together. CFOs largely still love the idea that Taylor uses around division of things, separation of duties, separation of finances. Like, if you're in charge of finance in a multinational organization, you need to have as much uniformity as possible to get the most accurate results. But not only that, if there's a problem, just troubleshooting these kinds of issues becomes massively hard. So uniformity, because actually finance is a lot like operations. It's a scale economy. They serve a lot of people and they have many-to-one relationships. So the way they scale the best and the way they get the most accuracy is by uniformity. The problem with that is it treats everybody largely the same in the organization. Now, there's a lot of customizations for the type of organization you are, and some of those organizations have to represent revenue certain ways, and there's GAAP to deal with. But my point is that finance is at the heart of a lot of the reasons that in the enterprise why there's DevOps organizations. It comes down to funding the work. And in many cases, finance doesn't know how to fund cross-functional processes without an owner somewhere, a business owner or somebody who's responsible for signing off on that level of dollar commitment. And so one of the things I think we need to examine is how much finance dictates the structures and HR dictates the structures that our organizations use. And I'm going to posit something to you, which is that DevOps is a symptom of our organizational dysfunction in the enterprise, because we don't see chief digital officers in a lot of the FANG companies, right? Because they're native and they're on that change trajectory. They're in transition all the time. They don't have to transform. They're in continual transition because their basic operating principles and models are to learn and gain more knowledge. And as they gain more knowledge, that learning affects their behavior. And then they unlearn the things that are no longer true, and they learn the things that are now true, and they operate in them. This is largely not true in the enterprise. So we spend a lot of time justifying why we have to do what we have to do to stay stuck. And my point about HR not helping, right? Spans, layers, these ideas. In general, we don't organize around the work. We organize around functional units, management of those functional units, and then compensation, reward, review in those functional units. The idea being they're closest to the work and the worker and can have an objective or more objective point of view on what it is they're doing. Therefore, they can be managed, incented, corrected, whatever needs to happen best that way. Turns out that's not true anymore. And it hasn't been true for quite a while, and yet nobody notices. And one of the places where you can really see it's true is when we outsource, because nobody actually knows at the point of contact what needs to be done, who's doing it, because it's very distributed. Procurement is definitely not helping this problem, right? Again, with finance, procurement optimizes for its best experience. In other words, it's locally optimized. And unlike finance, you can't make the argument that it is absolutely critical to locally optimize. Procurement optimizes for a lot of things in a lot of companies that don't make any sense in terms of flow for the actual work getting done. Procurement is not often seen as part of a supply chain in technology, but it is. And our lead times in that supply chain cause us to behave terribly in many cases. So I want to make sure that when we talk about this overall issue of who owns DevOps, because I maintain the only people that own anything in these companies are the people that own the companies themselves, right? Our disposition to always want to find accountability in an organization. Oftentimes when we say that, we feel like there's a lack of accountability, and or maybe the reason we feel that is we're not getting what we need or what we want from other people. So we want them to have some sort of answer, and we want them to have some sort of need to improve if it's not what we want. But accountability is one thing, but building a system, which is all of these components working together in one direction, is really, really important. And this system in your organization needs to include these pieces of the value stream: procurement, finance, and HR. All of these things help shape the organization. And I mentioned before the enterprise construct, which is just that notion that we have to protect the organization at all costs, and because that is what allows us to continue. And so the construct of kind of minimizing the ability for any one group to make enough change to actually fundamentally change the company has to change. It literally is in the way. And I mentioned before, unfortunately, the projects that have come out of a lot of these organizations that I've seen are the kinds of projects that DevOps do, right? Automation, building tool chains, building capabilities fundamentally. And I think that's what the real important piece is. Vendors have really swayed us into DevOps as a team building out continuous delivery tool chains and some automation. And that literally couldn't be further from the truth of the spirit of DevOps. There's a lot of confusion about how the organizations need to work together. But at the end of the day, DevOps is not a methodology. And that's very important. It's certainly not a software development methodology. It's certainly not an operational responsibility that gets contained inside of infrastructure and operations and kind of run outwards. Think about what the portmanteau has in it: development, operations. It's actually in the order of its value stream in terms of where work comes from and moves to, and literally was invented by Patrick Dubois, one of the co-founders of the movement, along with Andrew Clay Schaefer. And Patrick was looking for a domain name for the first DevOps Days conference, and he wanted to have a developer and operations conference, and basically that was the domain name he could find, which was Dev and Ops. So this is a term that's made to encapsulate a set of ideas about working together. Patrick's inspiration from when I talked to him about this was, working as a consultant and trying to help as a developer push fixes to operations and help them out and bridge that gap. And it wouldn't happen. It couldn't happen in the organizations that he was in. So he wanted to start a dialogue. How can we actually improve this experience and understand we're in this together? We can make each other better, and we can help the company in doing that. And so you couple that with Andrew's his kind of desire to have agile infrastructure that he was talking about at Velocity, and those two really formed the crux of a new movement to bring development and operations together in a way that we've seen in high velocity companies and kind of what we call greenfield companies, and certainly in the FANGs. And again, these aren't words you hear a lot in these places. These are values that they embody. So DevOps has taken on so many meanings, and for some people, they consider themselves evangelists. A lot of times I'm touted as a DevOps expert. I'm not even sure what that means, right? I think at the end of the day, we have all ascribed a lot of meanings to these made-up words, as Andrew's, one of his famous quotes is, "Let's argue about the definitions of made-up words." And so I think that when we talk about DevOps now, we're talking about almost like this. Think of it as like a way, a foothold, or a beachhead on thinking and working differently inside of organizational constructs, and focusing on the constraints to actually build a continuous value stream and a flow of value through development and operations, where they understand not only their own roles in this, but where they overlap and what they can do to recommon and help each other build new capability that actually serves the interest of getting ideas from our idea and from the need met to users having it in their hands to solve the problem. Remember, the only place we produce value is by having things in operations. Literally, the definition of business operations has something like create value, right? You're harvesting value from your assets. So things, capabilities you have, things you own, people that work for you, these notions are you're using production operations to create the value for your customers, whoever they are, whether they be internal, whether they be external ultimately. So really, really important is that our kind of organizational structures right now preventing us from doing a lot of the things that we see newer focused companies doing. And so DevOps is just literally a coping mechanism and kind of the first crack where an organization can start to experience what it's like to build a flow economy instead of an oppositional tribal economy. And that's important. So people say to me, well, if you don't like the idea of like an organizational unit set up, or another silo for DevOps, if you will, first of all, why? And then secondly, what are some other approaches that we could use? So CIOs and CXOs in general, but CIOs and CTOs specifically, have not really been able to answer some simple questions, it seems like, about where the organizational implications of DevOps are and really how to make it a strategic capability without embedding and making a team. So one of the biggest things that I talk about with executives is the whole notion of tribalism in their organization and how their communications can actually create tribes, not necessarily for the good. Tribes exist in many cases to kind of protect our individual value. I mean, that's really, really important, and our individual safety. So we will band together with people that maybe have the same interests or the same concerns or literally the same terror, right? We have to actually figure out how to get safe and we have to advance each other's values so that we can all remain in a company or remain in in any situation. So tribes have this notion that maybe in companies, we can perceive, the problem or, the enemy in some cases to be internal, inside of our company. And when that's the case, we don't win. And so if you think about a company making a large transition from operating in a certain way, and now they have to operate in a completely different way, taking on new behaviors, new characteristics, new technology, all of these things, how are we going to make that transition or that transformation to doing things differently? And that becomes the problem whenever you have an organizational unit that's set up as a DevOps org, and you've got somebody with that title. What it can mean is that's the definition of DevOps for the company. And all you have to do is look at the work that group is doing, and it can kind of be scary. So if you have tribes in your company, which I can guarantee you do, all you have to look at is look at a bunch of cubes and see all of the different universities and sports teams and things that people love. Those are all tribal identifications. Now, some of them are for pleasure, but at the same time, a lot of them are just things they went through to get their careers going and through their life. So we see lots of tribes in our organization, but imagine this. Imagine your infrastructure people feel like in order to keep the promises that they have to keep to the people that pay them and the people that determine whether they're going to be there day after day, in order to keep those promises, they have to protect themselves from people that cause them to not be able to keep their promises, in their opinion. And some of this can actually explain the predisposition of operations to kind of have the hand up when it comes to developers and other people that want to get into their infrastructure. And so a lot of times, even development teams, if you have a DevOps, group in your company or some sort of divisional structure or some sort of organizational structure, they are going to have to work with other teams and interact with other teams. The classic thing I see all of them doing, putting in continuous delivery pipelines. And so the problem with that is manyfold. You don't know if that's your biggest constraint. You don't know what that is. But secondly, the team that's got the responsibility to put these in place will approach a development team that probably has evolved a way of working and probably has made a lot of gains in the way they've been able to change their behavior and get certain results. So if you are a tight team, or maybe even a tribe, which kind of happens with some teams, right, or some development groups, you may not take kindly to another group of people coming in and saying, hey, we're going to change pretty much everything about the way you work. And we want you to use these tools because we're supporting it. I think a lot of us can see that there can be room for some problems there. And I think some of us have experienced what that feels like. And that kind of lack of cross-functional alignment can happen whenever we just create more functions, especially functions that aren't explicitly to be cross-functional. So what happens is the remit of the DevOps group winds up being the organization's idea of what DevOps is. And for people that know better, it just creates dissonance in their head. They're like, this is terrible, we're ruining it. And then for other people, executives and folks like that, they just see what it is and say, okay, that's the DevOps stuff. And instead of understanding that DevOps is really something that the executive needs to embody, because it's about a picture of flow in the organization and working across boundaries to actually strengthen the flow so that we can reduce our cycle times, sure. But what's most important is the actual throughput of the system and identifying things, especially the thing that actually is in the way or can limit or govern the throughput of the entire system that you can see. So in some cases, that could be the delivery processes into production. But I can tell you this, if production isn't ready for those delivery processes, you're not going to be able to keep your reliability promises in some cases. So we all have self-fulfilling prophecies in this if we aren't careful. But if we can cross the boundary, we can actually make those self-fulfilling promises work for us. So a little bit about alternative ways you could look at this. The crew concept. Crewing is something I think we understand in terms of we have positions, we have responsibilities, and we have somebody that's at the head of that in terms of a sport. But crews exist in an interesting way out there in the real world called volunteer fire departments, right? And these are all people with other jobs, other responsibilities, but they have a dedication to come train on a particular set of responsibilities and a particular role in the company, or actually the fire company, right? The notion is that when this crew is doing its regular job, it will get a signal of some sort, a pager signal, a cell phone text, Amber Alert style thing, right? Or you can actually hear in a lot of communities a fire whistle or siren. All of these things are to let the crew know time to assemble at the pre-chosen point, right? And get into the role that you're going to play and get into the trouble. In other words, let's go solve this emergency. And so the idea is you already know what you're going to do. You already even know in many cases what seat you sit in the vehicle. And you know what you're going to do when you get there. And you know what you're going to do when you're done and you come back and leave the equipment ready to use again. We all have a role, and then we go back to our work. And so one of the kind of modalities that I see operating in really successful organizations is we can actually dynamically organize around the work based on a signal. It's like it's orchestrated. And I talk about management's role inside of these organizations. And one of the things I talk a lot about is how it's more akin to orchestration than it is to child rearing, right? The kind of etymology of management goes back to manger, the idea that we have to raise things. And that there is some element of fomenting and support and building, but this is not a family relationship here. What we're talking about is that the management of the team really isn't the goal. It's the learning of the team that's important, and the team's ability to actually work. So I think one of the problems that we have is that management doesn't see some of the things we need them to see right now. And we may not necessarily have the language to communicate with management about those things. So part of what DevOps really can be is this cross-functional ability to learn to tell each other's stories better, to create a bigger story, a better narrative, a more powerful narrative when we want to get the business to move. If development and operations work together, they can make a lot of institutional change that a lot of people didn't think would be possible, but they have to collaborate. And by snipe shooting at each other, they're not getting the influence that both organizations deserve in the overall company. And the level of focus keeps getting pushed down lower into the org for DevOps. And that's just not something that's sustainable. So the temporal team concept is really powerful. And I think that idea of how we organize can be a place. We also see project-oriented work and even program-oriented work where folks are actually participating like with almost like a call of duty, in the sense that you have a time that you serve on this team and then you rotate back. And I think a lot of companies understand that rotation-oriented teamwork, which is collaboration across multiple functions, not a functional unit called the DevOps team, right? It's a multifunctional situation where they can come out of their functions and collaborate in order to get work done. In other words, they're organizing around the work and understand that it takes all the functions to get it done. And the more that those functions understand what each other do, the more we get done, the faster we get it done, and the more we shift problems to the left. So one of the things that's really important to understand these multifunctional teams is to understand that DevOps, if you're looking at like a Venn diagram, there's a lot of people that say dev and ops need to be the same circle. They just have to come together and be literally all in the same circle. So we should have developers wearing pagers, doing operational duties, and doing all of these things. And I would suggest to you that sometimes that can really work well in small organizations and in startups. And it may even work for you in a large organization. But most of us in larger organizations need to have some sort of structure around what we do. And so I find that having leadership that rotates and having team members that do rotations and keeping the whole thing dynamic keeps it becoming owned by any one person. Whoever stays there the longest, right? Whoever hangs out the longest contributes more ideas in theory. And so we want this to come from everybody. We want to expose people to this work because we actually really change our mindsets by doing. Instead of thinking and then doing changes our mind. And this is something that I think a lot of us are not familiar with. Mike Rother talks a lot about this in the Toyota Kata, how actually the way you work yourself out of learned helplessness is by using the scientific method over and over and over again to solve problems. And the Toyota Kata, or the improvement kata, actually takes a subset of that and makes it a super high cycle rate, fast way to do it every day that's light, but makes massive change over time. So one of the best places for these folks that want to practice DevOps is to use continuous improvement approach like the kata and actually find big constraints organizationally and put cross-functional groups together to iterate through fast experiments with a kata, like Toyota Kata, and actually eliminate those constraints. So if you want to have a constraints busting crew that's constantly rotating but has a nice mission because we figured out organizationally what our constraints are, executives, right? This is stuff where you can help. But the idea is that we can actually bridge these problems and knock out a lot of the toil, knock out a lot of the stuff that's preventing us from working better together, right? But by rotating people in from development teams, operations teams, security teams, network teams, right? Compliance teams, all of these places, we can actually start to get a fuller picture and start to build a learning organization. That's what's key, is that we can actually develop a learning organization that actually has a playbook for cross-functional alignment. The answer is not to get rid of all the silos. It really isn't. And I'm not saying that we couldn't do better organizing, but they're there, and you're not probably going to change them. The best thing to do is figure out how to hack them. And cross-functional alignment allows the tops of all of those silos to be open and actually allows parts of the insides so that people can actually permeate those organizational silos regularly. So that is a thing I would suggest. Use continuous improvement, use a kata, and start to assemble cross-functional teams and solve these problems together. And with the idea that we have not a single Venn where we have one circle, we actually have two circles here, and there is an overlap between development operations. I would suggest start with a Pareto shape. What are the 20% of the things that an operator could learn about development that will actually make operations better. Like, what do we do with software? Oh, a script is software? Wow, I should put that in version control? Well, this is really interesting. And likewise, developers can learn. Oh my gosh, that's why you keep having to talk to me about servers and the primitives like storage and memory and CPU, right? These things, when we start to have an understanding together of what it is that's holding us back, we can work on them together if we have a systematic way of doing it. And then I think I kind of mentioned the initiatives or the big projects that we work on. Again, it's very important to build those rotations. This argument that, well, they know the most, they're going to get it done the fastest, actually reveals a short-term thinking problem that we have, which is that we aren't envisioning the whole task. The whole work does not involve just getting it out the door. There's somebody who has to deal with that thing and support it day one and day whenever, all the way to the end of its life cycle. And based on legacy things, if that thing works, we're not going to get rid of it, right? So we need to be able to build organizational resilience and more response options in the organization, right? Our repertoire of responses has to get better than call the person who knows it the most. That doesn't scale. When people's names are in the value stream, we're broken. And like literally, sometimes the organizational decisions have to escalate until those two organizations are under the same leader, and we ask that leader to make the call. First of all, we've put a simple operational decision or some sort of decision in many cases that needs to be made at the layers that we're at, or maybe one above us. But when we take it multiple layers, we take the first of all, the Eckhoff principle of the higher you go in the organization, the more you know about less. And the lower you go in an organization towards the work, you know less, but you know a lot, but you know it about a lot fewer subjects, right? You specialize. So, while they know less about more, you know more about less. And so that divide becomes very, very important to span. And when we take up these, there's this whole concept called stratums, and people are organized in many cases by the length of decisions that they can make, the kind of conversations they can have about 1-year changes, 2-year changes, 5-year changes, and listen to the stories people tell in your organizations and listen to how long those stories are in time frames. And you'll notice as they go closer and closer to the detail of work, those time frames shrink down. I'm not saying we don't make long-term decisions, but our focuses shrink. And so when we take something up the stack to get a question answered, we're maybe putting the executive in a situation where they don't have the best answer. They're going to rule based on what they know of the organization, dispositions, their gut feeling, or they're going to tell you to take it to somebody who can make the decision. The point being is when our organizations don't function correctly cross-functionally, we escalate too much, and now that manager is in the value stream rather than the teams who produce the goods and services, right? So the key piece is decisions need to get made in the right place. There needs to be enough agency for the teams to actually make decisions about work that they know far more about than anybody else. Certainly an executive 3 layers removed from them would admit to knowing. So a lot of important ways to organize, rotate, and do the work. And literally any department head could say, hey, I need a DevOps effort. I need to assemble a team that will collaborate and is diverse because this problem is complex. Diverse collaborating teams that are assembled are one of the best ways to deal with complexity. And one thing I would suggest as technical folks that we may not do right off the bat is add somebody who you would consider naive to that problem-solving group. In other words, somebody that doesn't have the technical details of it. And one of the reasons is you need this. Everybody that gets hyper-focused on bits, bytes, all kinds of things, may miss one of the most powerful questions that actually could unlock a lot. And so when you invite a person who is not necessarily the subject matter expert to this, naive is not, by the way, some sort of way to talk down about this person. This means they have a different point of view and they may not be subject matter experts. But what the value they can provide is, and I'll tell you one meeting that I was in, it was amazing. I listened to 2 engineers going off on an IP address scheme, and I'm sitting here thinking in my head, none of this matters. And I'm saying, why are they arguing over this so much? And then the naive person in the room says, why are we even doing this? And they look at her like the answer is obvious. And she said, it's not obvious to me why we're going through all of this change right now. And what she did was proceed to contextualize the important mission critical things that were happening in the organization at that moment. And all she understood was that this stuff that they were talking about was the foundation of how everything talks to each other in the entire building. She just realized now is not the time to shift the earth underneath the people that are carrying a large burden. That was pretty freaking profound, right? Like business people saying, hey, I appreciate you got to do that at some point. But right now, while we're transforming, maybe not a good time. Like we can only move so many things at once. And while we're moving, we're at risk of keeping our promises. We're changing. Some behaviors may get dropped and we might not do the right thing all the time because we're learning. So important stuff to keep in mind. So the other thing I'm going to start to talk about here at the end, which is the organizational capability that DevOps can create, is kind of starting to see things beyond even the development and operations end of things, right? All of our work coming from somebody else, all of our work going to somebody else. What does that value stream look like? Who's one step above us or before us in the value stream, and who are the people that are, the next step in the value stream from us? Because I think one of the hard things about technology groups is the many-to-one relationships. We, in many cases, get work from multiple people, and we deliver work to multiples of people. So these two many-to-one relationships can make it hard to see the patterns and flow. So one of the key things that you'll see in DevOps, as you start to dissect these problems that a lot of us have shared, in terms of the organizational dysfunctions, how we're pitted against each other at basic economic models. I mean, Jay Bloom has an incredible thing I'll get to here in a second, just on the notion of how the economic models are pitted against each other between development operations. Executives need to learn to see the flow and understand the roles of these organizations. So I think what's important here is platforms as interfaces can help us actually start to digest some of this problem too. And we've had this conversation. This is an old picture, right? I think this goes back to Andrew and Damon's presentations early on in the days of DevOps about this wall of confusion, throwing things over. But one of the things that we've actually seen is organizations can solve this because essentially development is economies, and it's economy of differentiation. It literally is building new things and actually allowing us to kind of seek out new needs, meet our client needs through a lot of different approaches. And then this drives a lot of technical decisions where we actually have to differentiate as well with frameworks and all kinds of things, right? So the problem with that is that operations is an economy of scale, which literally means they're measured by how many things can they manage with how many people, a ratio. And their cost curve is almost always heading down by a percentage every year. So one of the problems they have, and one of the basic explanations for this kind of crazy divide is, if you're coming at operations with a ton of differentiation, another way to say that in some operational language be a bunch of snowflake applications that are all completely different, right? If you're coming at them with a ton of variety, it becomes hard for them to scale. As a matter of fact, the negotiation of all of that variety into production becomes very tedious, long, and full of lead time. So it's a problem when you have one organization that's not made to handle variety and another one that generates pretty much endless variety. So the thing that Jabe came up with that I think is really brilliant is to create economies of scope between the two of these. In many cases, they could be a platform. In infrastructure, we understand that a lot of our resources can be exhausted or completely consumed. Network, storage, people, all of those things, right? And one of the key places that we need is an economy of scope where the more it's used, it's not exhaustible. It actually provides more value. The more functionality and cross-functional functionality that you build into a common platform, and the more people that use it, the more powerful it is. So scope economies are one of the things that we can use to absorb the variety from a differentiation economy. And the simple way that works out is, and I'm going to kind of give you the simple version of it here, is we can actually build all of the kind of frameworks, the things we need into platforms that allow the developers to asynchronously interact with the platform, develop, test, add capabilities to the platform. That's great, but then they're reused, right? And then we see that the operations folks know how to run platforms, and they can run a lot of uniform platforms. In other words, each one is less work to them and less variance than all of the individual applications that people were writing before they could attach them to a platform. Also, it became much harder for our business people to find these individual apps and scale them across business units. So Jabe has a really great talk on the three economies and recommenting here in the Commons. I highly suggest you check that out. It's really, really important, though, that the things that start here in terms of differentiation economies might actually be far more valuable in a scope or multi-user economy. And some things that we learn from the platform economy are actually being used in the economy of scale. We're starting to see operations groups, infrastructure groups all over the place adopt platforms like OpenShift and other things to actually create more and more of that uniformity and also to serve themselves the same way. The big thing that's important with DevOps is that the economies of scale and differentiation all do a lot to make platforms work. So they are recommenting the things they've learned and the benefits and capabilities they've made into a platform of scope. And this keeps it fresh. This allows it to have more value over time to more and more people. So when we put a platform as the interface between the two of these, we can decouple the need for operations and development to have to negotiate things like storage, CPU, all of those crazy things that developers just should not have to be concerned about in most scenarios. So I'm going to kind of talk about that, in light of what we do at Red Hat, which is, a lot of what Jabe and I really believed when we did Praxis Flow, which is actually Praxis is the term for, practice-informed theory. And so I think a lot of people get frustrated with just pure theory, but I want to remind you that theory is hypotheses that have some evidence. And in many cases, reproducibility in science, depending on what areas you're talking about, is pretty hard. And so in some cases, theory is the highest information we have. But as we use practice that understands the theory, but then adjusts it to constraints, to reality, we can actually advance things. And so our group is here to work with executives and senior IT leaders in organizations to start to do that in your own organization. And some of those practices that we've learned and that we've invented in some cases require us, well, actually all of them, to change our behavior. That is what practices mean. So when we talk about behavior change informed by theory and then modified by more practice, it becomes really, really synergistic, and we need organizations to see that across the organization system, not just in the local situation or our organizational unit or our tribe or our team. So I think it's important, and I want to make sure and attribute Jabe Bloom, my partner here, because a lot of this work comes from his PhD in terms of the three economies. Again, really, really recommend you check out his presentation on recommenting. I think it's powerful and really kind of embodies the spirit of a lot of what we do here at Red Hat. So with that, I'm going to say thanks. And if you want to continue this conversation, I'd love to do it on Twitter. I'm at Kevin Behr, all one word, B-E-H-R, just like the paint. And love to follow back and engage in direct messages if be. But this is a fun place to have discussions, Diane.
Yeah, I really totally appreciate it. And that you came and you delivered it. It's always awesome and incredibly insightful. Next week, Jabe is going to be back, and he's going to do something on anticipatory awareness and its effect on finding common ground. So it'll feed right into what you've been talking about today. I loved how today, how you started out with reminding us all that DevOps is not a methodology, right?
Yes.
That was, it encapsulates a set of ideas, but it's not like agile or waterfall or any of that. and the little bit about, that it started out as a domain name for an event. I think that encapsulates so much in terms of, what happens when management and leadership doesn't quite get what DevOps is. And I think you did a really nice job on that, and, and how we can make that transmission to do things differently
Yeah.
across. It reminded me back in the day when I worked at Fujitsu as a very
Yeah.
baby programmer.
Yeah.
The thing that you talked about leadership rotating, I can remember that happening to me in the early 80s, because
Yeah.
Fujitsu obviously is that, and I was doing process manufacturing software. And I can remember how hard it was to get my brain around the folks swapping management, and they were actually doing it
Yeah.
back then in the early days. And I'm old as dirt. And I can remember as someone who went to computer science in Mythical Man month period,
Oh
and
gosh, yes.
back in the day, that
OS
my whole
360
brain
days.
was like, why is that dude from finance sitting in, they physically moved people in offices too. So
Oh
like
wow.
it was
Wow.
really pretty cool. I do recall one of them falling asleep in a meeting, but I think that was jet lag. Um,
Yeah,
I'm not going to blame him for that. I think he was having like, that was actually interesting working in a Japanese company,
oh
because
gosh.
they
Yeah.
would work all day with us and then be online all night with and talking on the phone with it was terrible for them. It was a
Oh
bad situation.
wow.
But it was a great place to see Kata in action.
Oh
Um,
gosh, yes.
was really, really cool. And I thought that was an interesting thing to remind people about. And the other thing that was really nice today, that I heard, the differentiation economy versus the scope economies metaphor that you used in terms of and and I think for developers, this is where the one that clicks in is like the modularity of code, the reusability of services, and to be able to, we have, for us who are developers, that is something that we can live with.
Mm,
We can get our brain around it. It's, really
yeah.
great stuff. I've got a little bit of time. Dan and Manavan, I'm happy to let you jabber in if you want to. I'll unmute you, and if you want to add
Why
into
are we
this.
muting Dan? He's a valuable contributor.
Yeah. So, hey, um, welcome if you want to unmute yourself and chime in. But, there's a lot of things. Yeah, Dan was saying he really liked the changing temporal windows illustration as you move up and
Yeah.
down the levels of the organizations, and how window references affects decision making. It's,
Yes.
yeah. Uh,
There's a
it,
lot of powerful stuff around frame theory, and maybe we can get Jabe at some point if we convince him to talk about frame theory, which is, literally the notion that we all have a different picture in our minds of the way things are, and a lot of times our frames don't overlap.
oh, absolutely.
Right? And so I think that's really important. And I loved what you were saying about, Fujitsu and, the notion right around that time, quality circles were like a big thing, and a
Oh,
lot of
yeah.
them total quality management. And again, another thing that management ran off with and didn't totally understand. And the organizations that didn't need to adopt it. Like they already had it in their DNA, right? And so everybody trying to actually impose that on top of an organization, it was just like, wow, it was hard to watch. But the same thing in groups of folks in DevOps. This isn't an organizational structure, right? This is just something that's a passion and a pursuit and a need of the company.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Awesome.
we're not
Awesome.
good at building passion in companies, I guess. We got to work on that.
Well, it's also, there's a fine line. I also was thinking about the metaphor of tribes versus crews. And
Mm,
the tribal mentality, and anyone who's been in tech, especially women, have seen those tribes, and people get defensive and all of that. And the idea of the volunteer fire crew, as you get a notification, you just show up, you get on the truck, and you go put out the fire. And that whole notion of crews versus tribes, um, and assembling people from across domains and silos, to do that work together. And I think one of the things that I like about Red Hat is there's a lot of that. You see
yeah,
people coming together to do things, whether it's, we have an outage on something,
yeah,
and everybody, the security people have to get involved, and the operations team, and then because we eat our own dog food, the people who actually wrote the code, so
exactly.
you see this all of a sudden. something will go wrong and everyone will come together. And I think that's DevOps in action to
Yeah,
me.
we do crews. We get that, and I love seeing that, as we interact, and I think that having some of that in our DNA has kind of allowed us to stand on the shoulders of those giants and see further in some cases. And yeah, I think you're right. It's like it's really really beautiful in motion, because what happens is you get this cross-functional empathy. You'll start to see people on a chat group in the company that are from a business unit going, "Hey, hugs to the guys in ops, right? Because you guys are dealing with it right now,
Yep.
right? Instead of you failed us, right?
Oh yeah.
It's that understanding of that larger picture, right? And how we kind of not only have to work together, but we have to sense together, and we have to develop some part of a shared frame with each other in order to actually have an understanding of what's even happening in our companies.
Yeah.
Because most of what we do creates tribes. Whenever we discipline a team, right, we push them together. And from a diversity perspective, is where I'll end. Tribalism creates more barriers for diversity in organization than just about anything. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are we so afraid of that we need to band together and try and protect ourselves? Because all we're doing is protecting ourselves from success.
Yeah. And
I don't understand it at all. And we have to
yeah.
get past these fears.
But I think, it's times like these. We're in COVID. The world is changing. Everyone is tense a little bit, I think, worried about their jobs probably. So
No doubt.
there's a tendency to put, more of those silos up. And I think the thing we all have to keep coming back to is one for me is transparency. I think transparency in processes and responses to things, issues and stuff like that, so that when we follow up after an outage or an incident or, a request from a customer, that we're transparent with each other and with the customer or with, whomever we've caused the issue for. Then I think then we can actually collaborate. And there
Yeah,
was
yeah.
and I and
We have
that
to
we keep
face that moment where this is where leadership can step in, but this is where anybody can step in and say, listen, the goal here is we have a common problem. We have a common goal. We may even have a common enemy. So super tribes, this is what we have to have, right? The tribes all have to see that the threat to them is greater if they don't form a super tribe and address the external threat, right? If we're
yeah,
worried about our jobs, well, we can actually understand a little bit about what makes our companies work, right?
yeah,
And so I think that in many cases, the threat to our organizations, the threat to our livelihoods, is so much more important than my squabble with Bob in ops about getting my change through, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
seriously, do you
Re-
love paychecks? you know,
Level
let's do
up,
order of
boys and
magnitude
girls. Yeah,
analysis.
yeah.
Yeah.
Level it up. I think that's really the key here is like, can we
And
just
that's the
level
leadership
up the
job. Paint
conversation?
that, paint why we have to have that. Tell me why, You're right.
Well, I'm still gonna say I love the T-shirt. It's a fact. 6 out of 7 dwarves are not happy, but they're
Yes.
all working together. And you may not be happy, but we'll get
Exactly right.
some level of happiness working with you and with the GTO office. And it's been a pleasure again having you here. And we'll share the slides, and please do continue the conversation over there on Twitter. And I look forward to having you again, and Jabe and Andrew and everybody else there. And if someone has a topic they want to hear more about, or, I always have this little quote that pops up on my reminders is, who is the one person that you'd like to hear from?
Oh
You
yeah,
know?
yeah.
And so if you're out there and there's somebody who's done something transformative, cultural shifting, that you want to hear from, let me know. I will wrangle them on here. We've had some great folks, John Alsop, Ben
Oh yeah.
Moser, and other folks coming on, and Kat Sweet, just some
Oh, Cat
amazing.
Sotell is amazing. Yeah, yeah. You're lucky to get Cat.
I
And
know.
Jabe will melt people's minds next week. I'm excited because I'm going to tune in because that's a great, great
All
talk.
right. Me too. I love having my mind melted on a Friday afternoon. Goes right into my weekend. So
Yeah.
thanks again, everybody, and really take care.
All right. Take care.